we are delighted to introduce Kathasaritasagara, the Sea of Stories. Please welcome Rohini Chowdhury, Deepa Agarwal in conversation with Ranu Bhattacharyya and introduced by Namita Gokhale. The session is presented by Dainik Bhaskar.
Dear friends, as the Jaipur Literature Festival reaches its 4th day and the last day is tomorrow, thank you all for being here in what is in itself a Kathasaritasagara. The Jaipur Literature Festival is full of stories within stories within stories. In fact, even my new novel, Jaipur Journals, is stories within stories and stories. It's a huge privilege for me to be here with people whose work I've admired over the years. Deepa Agarwal and I have done a lot of collaborative work together, and I have just written the introduction to Rohini's Kathasaritasagara. I want to ask I want to apologize at the very beginning because about 5 minutes into the conversation, I need to slip out because of some problem I have to attend to. Now for my introduction. Can we shut those doors or we leave them open, or what is the story here? It's a bit distracting. Or is it too hot to open the doors? It's wonderful to... Not audible? Is that better? Everybody can hear me? I think there's a lot of sound coming from outside. It's wonderful to introduce a session that looks deep into the core of storytelling and of ancient narrative traditions in India. Please, those of you who can't hear me in the last row, put up your hands. Okay, she just put up her hands like that. The 3 learned women, the Vidushis here with me, have all worked on different aspects of storytelling. Rohini Chowdhury is an accomplished translator whose works include The 3 Princes of Persia and Gautam Buddha, the Lord of Wisdom. I've had the privilege of writing an introduction to her recent translation of Somdev's Kathasaritasagara. Deepa Agarwal is the author of over 50 books. Her version of Vikram and Betal Tales, which is called Listen, O King, 5 and 20 Tales of Vikram and Betal, has many overlaps with the Kathasaritasagara. And all of us are familiar with the Vikram and Betal Tales because of what we have encountered on television. But actually, if you do read the Vikram and Betal Tales in a more serious edition, as some of them appear even in Rohini's Kathasaritasagara, you find they are very, very, very deep stories that look at the essential questions of what is right, what is wrong, what is dharma, what is good practice. Both Deepa and Rohini have also worked with Devaki Nandan Khatri's Chandrakanta. They also share an interest in folk tales. Ranu Bhattacharyya is the perfect moderator for this session, as she is an educator in international schools and grounds her classroom practice on the idea we all have stories to tell. So I think a lot of the session is about this specific Kathasaritasagara of Somdev, but it's also about the general Kathasaritasagara that is the sea of stories that we all belong to in some way. She discusses the strategies of reading and writing in her book, The Castle in the Classroom, Story as a Springboard for Early Literacy. They will speak on many themes that include adapting ancient narratives for contemporary readers, the migration of stories from one language to another, one culture to another, and the power of stories in general. The marvelous tales of the Kathasaritasagara continue to fascinate readers across centuries and across millennia. Rohini Chowdhury's vibrant English translation brings this fascinating repertoire of stories to life. These are frame stories which were written sometime around AD 1070 in the 10th, 11th centuries, attributed to a Kashmiri Shaivite. They lead one into the other. They are held together by multiple threads as characters and situations weave together different voices and raconteurs. They were written, I think, to please a queen, and they really do have that compulsive storytelling in them. The original text had 18 sections which were compiled for this Queen Suryavati, the royal consort of King Anantadev of Kashmir. Large portions were inspired by the early epic, the Brihat Katha, written by Gunadhya in the vanished Paishachi language. I've always wanted to do a session around the Paishachi language because whenever anybody has talked about it, it has really provoked my interest. I hope sometimes I can get 4 great experts to speak about it. The Brihat Katha, Sanskrit, the great narrative, was the source material for a fount of other works, including the Kathasaritasagara, the Brihat Katha Manjari, and the Brihat Katha Shlok Samgrah. Paishachi was a language of the bhoots, of ghosts and ghouls, a version of the Prakrit language now completely lost to oblivion, except for literary and historical references that remind us that it once existed. We have to remember that the nature and purpose of stories is to share human experience, so we can learn from the follies and mistakes of others, as well as from their wisdom. The ancient stories of the Kathasaritasagara were literally a treasure of shared encounters and wanderings, of travels and imaginative retellings, as the people of those long ago days tried to expand their circle of knowledge beyond the borders and boundaries of their own lives, which is really why we all come to stories and come back enriched from hearing them. The essentials of human nature remain the same across time and place, centuries and continents. At a time when terrain and geography limited the exchange of information, these stories, travelers' tales, fables all help people to dream of places they might never actually see, to imagine mountains and oceans, birds and beasts, quests and voyages that help them expand their conception of the world they lived in, because they didn't have the same visual, tactile images. We all know what's happening around the world. This was the time where everybody, they got their version of the larger world only from these stories, told and retold and retold. This enchanted world of once upon a time never changes. The exiled prince, the captured princess, the jealous wives, the foolish king, the wise emperor, these timeless stories exist around us everywhere. They exist in the Game of Thrones, they exist in ancient Japanese novels. We are each other's stories. The Kathasaritasagara helps us explore and understand our past and to recognize and appreciate the unending ocean of stories around us. Now at the end of it, she'll say, here she'll announce that the books are available for sale and all, but I really do advise you, when you get the time, don't just go for the bestsellers which are on sale, they're all wonderful, but do go back to these ancient classics, to the Kathasaritasagara, and to Listen, O King. Thank you very much. Now I'll listen in and then I'll slip out. I'm so sorry if I took up too much time. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Namita. A year and a half ago, I stood at the southeastern edge of the Anatolian plateau, and I was staring into this marvelous site called Göbekli Tepe. Now, this was built about 10,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, by early Stone Age hunters and gatherers. And what the site contains is these massive T-shaped pillars built out of stone, and they're carved with figures of birds, animals, and insects. And they're instantly recognizable even today after a passage of 12,000 years. Some people even think that these T-shaped pillars themselves were the first representations of the human form. But as someone passionately interested in stories and storytelling, And what gave me almost like goosebumps when I walked through the site was the circle of stones which resembled seats or benches around these T-shaped pillars. And it wasn't very difficult to imagine that there were these ancient men and women gathered together, much as we are gathered here today, their faces lit by flickering camplight, listening in hushed silence as the orator or the bard of the tribe explains stories. Stories, as you know, as Namita said, are essential to the human experience. They're essential to our existence. And it seems only fitting that we are here at the Darbar Hall during the Jaipur Literature Festival, which celebrates each other's stories, talking about the oldest extant collection of stories, the Kathasaritasagara. So welcome aboard as we journey on this ocean of the streams of stories, along with Rohini and Deepa and myself. So we'll turn to Rohini. Namita has already talked about how this was compiled in the 11th century AD, and it has 350 stories, 20,000 shloks. It's longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. Tell us a little bit more about the Kathasaritasagara.
Thank you. Can you hear me, everybody? Yeah? So thank you, Namita and Ranu. The Kathasaritasagara is a remarkable text. It is something that I have loved from my childhood. The stories are absolutely magical and they draw you in and hold you from the word go. But apart from my own personal love for this text, the Kathasaritasagara is a very unique text in Sanskrit literature. It is a text meant purely for entertainment. The stories are just fun. There are no morals, there is no preaching, and that in itself is unique in Sanskrit literature, which usually tends to teach something or the other. Also, as Namita and Ranu pointed out, this Kathasaritasagara was compiled in the 11th century CE. But the compiler himself, who is Somdev Bhatt, who we tend to call the author of the Kathasaritasagara, but he isn't really an author in the sense that we understand the term today, in that the stories that he has written are not original tales that he's made up. They're not a product of his imagination, like, say, a novel that you or I might write. These are stories that he has collected, and he himself tells us that these are drawn from a much, much older text, as Namita pointed out, called the Brihat Katha, written by somebody called Gunadhya. And also, interestingly, there are other works which have drawn on this supposed older text, and the earliest such text that we see dates back to the 6th century CE. It's a Jain text written in Jain Prakrit. So these stories are very, very ancient. They go back, we don't know how far. And Somdev has brought them together in this absolutely fascinating way. So it is a text that is very difficult to describe. It's different from anything else you will come across. It has features that are common to other Sanskrit texts, but at the same time, it really stands out as something very different in classical Indian literature.
So, Rohini, do you have a favorite story in the Kathasaritasagara?
That's very difficult to pick one. In fact, my book is fundamentally stories that I have liked. I've picked them out. They're my favorite tales. But yes, there are, let me say 3 which really stand out in my mind. One is about a young man called Shringabhuja and how he marries the Rakshasa's daughter, and how they then outwit the Rakshas to run away from him. And the Rakshasa's daughter is very beautiful, very accomplished, and very much in love with her husband. But the Rakshas is a very, very protective father. He doesn't think that anybody is good enough to marry his daughter. But his daughter, Angaravati, is determined to marry this young man. So first she helps him to perform all the tasks that her father says. For instance, he says, here's a bag of seeds. Please go and plant them all outside the city by morning. Well, that was a superhuman task, but his daughter with her magic makes it happen. So then the Rakshas says, oh my God, he's done it, now what? So he says, unplant them, collect all the seeds and bring them back. Again, how would a human do it? But the daughter calls up all the ants and they collect all the seeds and bring it back. And so on and so forth. And finally, he has to agree to let her marry him. Then they say, okay, now we need to go away from here. We don't want to live with him. How to make your getaway? So the princess tells her husband, she says, you know, my father, he's a very powerful Rakshas, but he's a little bit silly. So don't worry. You know, he tries to fight me. I know as much magic as he does. And then she, you know, somehow does or plays tricks back on her father. For instance, he's chasing them and she, with her magic, hides her husband and takes on the form of a postman, a letter carrier. And the Rakshas comes and says, have you seen this young woman and her husband? She says, no, I'm too busy. I'm going to the, such and such place with this letter which says that this Rakshas is dead. So he looks at her and he says, really? Am I dead? I better go find out. So he runs back to find out, am I dead? So stories like this, so that's one which is really interesting. And this story, interestingly, is found even in Scandinavia, parts of it. And that's another feature of the Kathasaritasagara. These stories are found in the most unexpected places, as we were discussing this morning, Arabian Nights, Sinbad the Sailor, the Bible, Jonah and the Whale. There are similar stories scattered throughout the world. So it's very hard to say which is my favorite.
Now, one of the collection of stories in that is the Vetal stories, the Vikram and Vetal stories. And I know, Deepa, you've done a lot of work on the Vikram and Vetal stories, though I believe it is from another source. So would you shed light on a little bit on that?
Okay, thank you, Ranu. I hope I'm audible. Well, the Kathasaritasagara is an extraordinary work. And it amazes me, that the stories continue to thrill and fascinate us. And one of the stories about the Kathasaritasagara is something which gave me goosebumps, was about the original version written by Gunadhya, and how he was one of Shiva's guns who was sent to earth because of a curse. And there he is writing his story with his own blood, in the forest, on leaves, and the king for whom he is writing it rejects those stories, and then he burns it up. And first he tells it to the birds and animals, and he burns his manuscript, and it was like a metaphor for us writers who, if a manuscript is rejected, there are authors who would confine it to the fire. So anyway, this was just by the way, because I'm really going to tell you about the Vikram Vetal stories. Now the Vikram Vetal stories, I think most Indian children are familiar with them. And I grew up reading them in the Chanda Mama, a very popular magazine. And the thing is, there are only 25 stories, but Chanda Mama made up new stories. And that fascinated me because there was always this image of this king carrying this corpse on his back, and the corpse is the Vetal, and how, because it was those stories were so popular, so the magazine had to keep on adding new stories. So now, talking about my book, Listen, O King. Now, it's not the Somdev version, but definitely, I'm sure it is based on the Somdev version. It's by a person called Shivdas, about whom we know very little, except that he was probably a courtier. And the way the book has been written, it's like, a lot of stories about well-to-do people, merchants, and the lifestyle of the time also comes through. But Shivdas, because I had earlier worked on the Somdev version as well, and I noticed a completely different style of storytelling. And here, this is what we're going to talk about later, and I'd like to take a moment to quote something from A.K. Ramanujan, the wonderful authority on our traditional tales. And incidentally, I happened to meet his son in the morning, and it was so exciting for me. So A.K. Ramanujan says in his introduction to folk tales from India that stories are metaphors in search of a new context, waiting to be retold and given new relevance. So, of course, we'll come to this later, but I thought, I'd mention this because it also demonstrates how the difference between Somdev's telling and Shivdasa's retelling. And I took my stories from a wonderful translation by this Sanskrit scholar, Chandra Rajan, who did a lot of work. Okay, wonderful. She did a lot of work on the Panchatantra also. So, now the difference that I found was Somdev's stories have more description and they're more rounded out, whereas Shivdas, he has a different style. He uses what is called the old Sanskrit Champu style where the story is interspersed with verses, whereas Somdev is entirely in verse. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating that there was less of the story element, there was a lot of description in the verses, and it seemed as if Shivdas is concentrating on the moral aspect, because we always think of the Vikram Vetal stories as, entertaining stories. And another thing which he did, he added, we'll be talking about the frame story structure that we have in our traditional tales. But he added another story. Now, to broadly mention to those of you who are not familiar with the Vikram Vetal tales, they're about the great King Vikramaditya, the extremely just and noble king, and a sadhu, a mendicant, comes to his court and says, I want to perform a special puja, and please help me. And I'm telling this very briefly because a lot goes on before this. And he asks him to come to the cremation ground on a particular day, on what we call the Amavasya, the dark moon night, with his sword in his hand, dressed in black. And the king sets off. And that is where the story begins, that the king has to go and fetch this corpse from a particular tree and bring it back to the sadhu, because he needs it for a particular ritual. But he tells him, don't talk to the corpse. It's going to say something and you better not answer. But the corpse is very cunning. The spirit in the corpse, the Vetal, it tells the king, I'm going to tell you a story, and at the end of it, I'm going to ask you a riddle. And if you don't answer, your head will burst. And if you know the answer and you don't tell it, your head will burst into 1,000 pieces. So, what is the king to do? So the story is told, and the king has to answer because he knows the answer, and the corpse flies back to the tree and back, back and forth, back and forth. That's how it is in these stories.
So on that tantalizing note, I have to step out for a minute, but do continue your own private Vikram and Vetal puzzles with this audience.
Thank you, Namita.
So it seems that we are living in this fantastic world, peopled with Rakshas, Vidyadhars, Peshachas, Daityas, Vetals, And we are living in these fantastic settings. I'd like to take a minute, because we know that stories are made up of characters, they're made up of settings, they have a plot. We've already talked a little bit about the plots being not preachy, but they're meant for entertainment, though sometimes you can derive morals from them. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the characters themselves. Particularly, there are so many characters to talk about, but there are two sets of characters which really fascinate me. One is the Vidyadhars, and the other is the Vetal. And both in your retellings, you've made some very conscious choices about how to even name them. And we talked a little bit about this in the morning. So let's talk a little bit about the Vidyadhars, for instance.
Yes. So the Vidyadhars are the key characters, the key beings in the Kathasaritasagar. Now, when we read the Panchatantra, your characters are animals because these are animal fables. You read mythology, it's gods and goddesses. But the Kathasaritasagar is distinguished by the fact that the primary characters are the Vidyadhars. And right at the very beginning, Deepa talked about a frame story. So briefly, a frame story is exactly what you would think a frame is. It's a frame, and inside it are all the other stories. So Somdev uses these frame stories very effectively. And the first frame is, he tells us how these stories came to be and why, and he ascribes a divine origin to these stories. That one day Shiv and Parvati are sitting on Kailash, and Parvati tells Shiv, please tell me a story, tell me a new story that nobody's ever heard. So Shiv, who never denies anything to Parvati, says, very well, I will tell you a story. I will not tell you about humans, because humans are always sad and they're always in trouble. Their stories are no fun. I don't want to talk about the gods, because what is there about the gods that you don't know? So I'll talk to you about the Vidyadhars. So Vidyadhar, the literal meaning means bearers of knowledge. They are semi-divine beings. They have supernatural, magical powers, superhuman powers, but unlike the gods, they are not mortal. And they, as Shiv says, live in this very happy zone between divine and human. And the Vidyadhars therefore become a very convenient device for the storyteller, because he can do anything. He can create any kind of world, he can give them any kind of powers, he can ascribe any kind of magic. And logic of, you can't say, oh, but humans can't do this. Yeah, but he's not human. And you'd say, oh, but a god won't do this. Yeah, but they're not gods. So it's a very happy zone even for the storyteller. And so therefore the Vidyadhar becomes a very, very intriguing personality in the Kathasaritasagar.
And what's really interesting is that the Vidyadhar it's not something that is, you're not born a Vidyadhar. You have to gain that knowledge. You have to have those 7 signs.
Correct. They're the 7 jewels that you have to acquire, and not anybody can acquire. So, for instance, another frame that Somdev uses is that of the story of Prince Narvahan Dutt. He is the kind of overarching hero of the Kathasaritasagar. And he uses his story to tell us all the 350 other stories. And when Narvahan Dutt is born, there is a prophecy that he is going to be emperor of the Vidyadhars. And therefore his whole life is geared to becoming that, to becoming one, a Vidyadhar, two, becoming the emperor. And through the Kathasaritasagar, there is this particular stream that runs about Narvahan Dutt's, how he achieves this goal. So interestingly, how to become emperor, he has a very, very simple strategy. Marry as many women as you can.
26.
26 wives.
26
the daughters of important kings, and so that's how he extends his kingdom. But he also has to have the valor, the courage, the wisdom, even more than strength of arms, to acquire the 7 jewels that will ultimately make him a Vidyadhar, and that happens only towards the end of this very, very long thing. So it's all very exciting to me, at least.
So the Vidyadhars are the semi-divine beings, and the Vetal, it's very interesting because the Vetal is sometimes translated in English versions as a vampire, and he is, I think it's a disservice to both the vampire legends as well as the Vetal legends, to think of them as being equal. So, Deepa, would you care to comment on that a little bit?
Yes, the Vetal is a spirit with special powers, but it's very hard to explain what kind of spirit it is. Because now in the Vikram Vetal, definitely it's a spirit with a lot of powers, and anyone, it's like a jinn. Someone can get it under their control, the Vetal is going to give them a lot of power. And that is one of the reasons why this sadhu, Shantishil, who is actually an evil man, he is trying to get the Vetal under his control. And he deputes Vikramaditya because he's a man of his word, and if he has given his word, he will do exactly what he has promised to do. And despite the fact that he has to go through the cremation ground, all sorts of terrible things are happening, and he goes to this tree and he finds this, corpse that is blue with age, and it leads him a merry dance in the beginning. He tries to catch it, it cackles, and it, jumps onto another branch, but Vikram is determined, and he catches hold of the Vetal somehow and doesn't let it go and takes him over his shoulder. Now, but what I have discovered is in the other set of Vikram stories, the Vetal is a man-eating monster, and King Vikram, who has been dispossessed by his elder brother, returns to his city, and he finds that there's a monster troubling the citizens. And he is eating up people one by one. He's asking for a sacrifice. And Vikram is able to outwit the Vetal and bring it under his own power. And that, a different set of stories begins. But now, in this particular set of stories, I have titled the book, Listen, O King. Now, why did I do this? I had earlier read Vikram Vetal stories in childhood, and they seemed entertaining, about a ghost and a king and a wicked sadhu. But in this, when I read these stories a bit deeply, it struck me that the Vetal here is kind of a guide to the king. He is testing him on the dharma of a ruler, because every time he poses a question to him, a riddle, it's about, judgment, about correct judgment. And this is why I gave the title, Listen, O King, because I felt the Vetal is actually fulfilling another role. It's not a monster, not
a vampire.
Certainly not a vampire. Unfortunately, he's been translated as a vampire. And now another thing about the Shivdas version. The Somdev version begins with the frame story of the ascetic coming to the king's court and giving him gifts and then asking for a favor, which is to fetch the Vetal. But Shivdas has added another introductory story. And this is a story of 3 boys born in the same day, and how all of them have the same destiny. They're born on the same day and in the same hour, and as is believed that they will share the same destiny. And one of them is going to prevail over the other 2 and become the ruler of the world. So now this explains the tussle between the sadhu, who is the evil one who's trying to take over what Vikram already has, his power as a king, as an important ruler. And the Vetal has already been murdered by the sadhu. And that's why he's a corpse hanging on a tree. So I found this very interesting because the other versions don't give this explanation. And I just wonder if Shiv Das just made up the story because he felt an explanation was required. Or maybe it did exist somewhere. So this is the thing about old stories. So,
Yeah, you just said that Shivdasha made up a story probably, and that brings in the role of the narrator and the very important choices that the narrator makes. I have to recount a little story from my classroom experience. I have a classroom where I steep my kids in stories, and after they are steeped in stories, they are making up stories. So we have sets, we have characters, and my philosophy is I give as little made up props and things to the kids as possible. So we used to do these stories all the time in our classroom, and the kids used to write their own versions of the folk tales and the fairy tales and their own versions. And we had a sign-up system for, the roles, the different characters, because as I said, we have characters in the story. We have the good guy, the bad guy. There could be animals or mythical. There could be actual people. And there was always a role for a narrator. And the sign-up system, I noticed that because I always step back, I started noticing that everybody was running to sign up for the the narrator role. And I was wondering about that. I said, why do people not want to be on stage? Why do these kids, 6-year-olds, 5-year-olds, not want to be on stage performing the king or the queen or the wicked person, the one with all the power, but they want to be the narrator. And it is so remarkable that even a 5-year-old can grasp the fact that the narrator controls the story. So we have versions of the story that you've written. We were talking in the morning about how it's a relay translation. And these stories are scary. These stories were not meant for children, but you have retold them for children. So I'm sure you've made some very specific choices while you were doing this. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Just to give a little more context first. So just let's look at how these stories have come to my book. Let's try and trace it. So first we are told that there is a Brihat Katha written by Gunadhya. We don't know if he's real or not. Sometime in the year dot, written in a language called Peshachi. The language is lost. The original Brihat Katha is lost. We don't know whether the writer ever existed or not. That is our state of ignorance. Somewhere around the 11th century AD, we find 2 works in Sanskrit, one by Kshemendra, one by Somdev. Both seem to have drawn on the same original source, and they have worked independently, and yet there is a lot of similarity between what they have written. There's this. Before that, the same story has been told in Tamil, it has been told in Prakrit, it has been told in various versions. And the same characters crop up. Okay, so now we come to my source text, which is Somdev. Now this, as Ranu had told us, is a very, very, very long piece of work, and Somdev's original had 125 chapters. This was further translated. Akbar got it translated in the 16th century in Persian. It went around the world like that. In the 19th century, Western scholarship got hold of it. They translated it into English. And finally, in the 1880s, a very, very enterprising person called Charles Tawney translated the entire work, all 125 sections, into English. And nobody else has dared do it after that. The work is just so overwhelming that to think, oh my God, I can translate all of it, not happening. So Charles Tawney's is the only English translation, full, complete translation that remains even today after so many years. So my retelling, I don't like to call it a translation, was really working from Charles Tawney. I had the Sanskrit text next to me, so I was comparing, but my primary source is Charles Tawney. So look at this. So Gunadhya wrote something, Somdev adapted it, Western scholars adapted it, Tawney translated it, I retold it. Look at the stages. So at each stage there has been a selection, there's been a choice. And as Ranu pointed out, these stories were never ever meant for children. traditionally in India, there's no such thing as children's lit. It's a concept we've imported from the West and relatively recently. And so these stories, when I was given this, Puffin said, can you do this for us and do it for children as an introduction to classics, ancient classics, I had to look at this and say, okay, so this has to be appropriate for the modern child in our modern context with our modern values. For instance, maybe there was a time when it didn't matter that you told a child stories about murder and mayhem and all the gory details. But today it matters. Parents don't want to expose children to that. Teachers don't want to. Children themselves are a little more sensitized to violence, and we don't want to fill their lives with nightmares in the process of merely introducing a text. So that was one choice I had to make. What kind of story from there should I take? Also, attention span. That of younger readers or younger listeners is shorter than that of adults. So the stories had to be interesting, exciting, fast-paced, and I couldn't go into those long-winded ones, however much I might personally have liked them. So I tended to choose stories which had a little more action happening. But ultimately, it does depend on the person who is translating or retelling what they choose. The translator and the reteller is supposed to be invisible, but actually that's not correct, and they should not be expected to be invisible, because no matter how much you try to make yourself invisible, your own likes, dislikes, value systems will come through, and that's absolutely happened in my selection of stories. For instance, my personal interest in science fiction and robots made me choose this story about wooden automatons.
That's my favorite story.
Yes, written as long ago as the 11th century. It's about a city, a complete city peopled by these wooden robots. I mean, my mind was blown. I said, oh my God, this is so exciting. Maybe another person wouldn't have chosen this. So these things come into how I choose.
I have to tell the story about the wooden robots, the people by the wooden robots. This carpenter creates these, he falls in love, and he wants to woo his beloved, and he doesn't have the means. So he creates these mechanical swans, and every night this mechanical swan, one by one, they go to the king's treasury and picks up a jewel in its beak and travels back. Of course, he's caught, and then he gets banished, and then once he gets banished, he builds this, it goes on. But when you're reading these stories, and when you're reading the Kathasaritasagara or you're reading the Vikram and Betal stories, you're constantly hit by a sense of deja vu. Where have I heard this before? Where have I heard a reference to this bird which is flying a princess on its back? Or where have I heard the story about a passage through the mountains? And it's clear, I mean, Rohini's talked about it, and Namita and Deepa, we've talked about it before, that, these stories traveled. I mean, we think this is an age of migration and movement, but there's been migration and movement forever. And these stories have traveled, they've influenced so many authors. And I'd like to go back to what you said about the Ramanujan quote right at the beginning, and talk about, that we are the stories. We are held together by stories, and maybe in new contexts, but stories matter. So why do you think they matter?
Well, let me mention in the poetry reading session, the Poetry Darbar, Ruth Paddle read this beautiful poem about the Arabian Nights, about Shahrazadi waiting for the Sultan to come. And, we know the story of the Arabian Nights, how she saved herself by telling the Sultan a new story every night. And we know that the Arabian Nights stories have been influenced by stories from the Kathasaritasagara. And very interestingly, if you recall Hans Christian Andersen's Princess and the Pea, now there's a story in the Vikram Betal stories called The Three Fastidious Brahmins. And there are 3 episodes. And the third episode is from where I think, because these stories were taken up by European scholars, as Rohini mentioned, and the story is so similar to The Princess and the Pea, you cannot miss it. Then we have a beautiful novella by Thomas Mann, no less than the great German novelist. And the story which both Rohini and I have retold is Transposed Heads. I'm not going to try and even say the German title because I won't be able to pronounce it properly. So in this way, they have Boccaccio also is indebted to our ancient stories. And, so you see that how Thomas Mann, when he uses the story of the transposed heads, he has depicted it, he has interpreted it as the, mind and body about because, the princess, what happens? The princess, the prince goes and offers his head to the goddess. He cuts off his head, and in some versions it's his friend who comes and also cuts off his head because he's so grieved that his, friend has cut off his head. And then the princess, the wife of the prince, is in despair, and she's told by the goddess that, put their heads back. And what happens? She puts the wrong head on the wrong body. And now she's in a fix. Who is her real husband? And in the Vikram Vetal stories, Vikram says that the head is because the head rules everything. And so it's interesting how a story can be interpreted, given new meaning in a new context, and really make us think about all the hidden meanings that, we can plumb with each reading a story at a different age or in a different mood, I would say, too. Sometimes, one is more receptive to the deeper meanings in a particular story. So the thing is that traditional tales, they were very entertaining. There's so much amazing fantasy. There's so many things like the Jamut Vahan story, which is about sacrifice. It's really a king, a Vidyadhar king, sacrificing his life to save a nag, a snake, who's going to be eaten up by Garud, who is the enemy of the nags. And then there are funny stories like the three fastidious Brahmins that I mentioned, about three, ridiculously fastidious brothers, and who are trying to claim that, it's a competition among them. Who is the most fastidious? And the king has to make a decision, how hard it is for kings always to make decisions and pass judgment. So this is the way, stories travel, storytellers tell them, they tell them in different ways, the way we have. And for example, using the Shivdas stories, there were a lot of erotic verses in between. Now, I cannot contain those verses in a children's story. And this is another problem that I found with the Vikram Vetal stories, that there are prostitutes, there are robbers, there are violent acts, as Rohini also mentioned. And how do you change it for the contemporary child? You soften it. You try to minimize your focus on that and you focus on something else. Then again, there's a story, the parrot and the myna, which is very, very anti-women, I thought. And that story really troubled me. But then, since I couldn't make a selection because I had to do the whole 25 stories. So I said, okay, this was a different time, the values were different, and I think children also will understand that this doesn't happen in our times, but maybe earlier this is the way people thought. So these are the choices you have to make. And definitely where language is concerned, you try to make your language as contemporary as possible so that the child is interested in reading the story and doesn't think that it's just some old story that is being palmed off onto her.
So there's something very clearly about the stories. I mean, these are very ancient we talked about how this was the oldest extant collection of stories in the world, but there's something about them that transcend time and space. They've traveled, they've survived, and they've been retold in various versions, and we've inherited them, and we've inherited this legacy. And I personally, I think steeping our kids, our children, the new generation, as well as ourselves, in this legacy that we have is something that we could pass on. I think we could keep on talking about stories, but this discussion is becoming very esoteric at this moment because we're also passionate about this particular text as well as others. So I'd like to thank both of you and maybe open up the floor to questions if you have any, and we'll have mics across if you have questions for any of us regarding what we've just spoken about so far. So thank you, Rohini, and thank you, Deepa, and open the floor to questions.
Hello. Hi. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for this session. It was very thought-provoking. My question is to all of you individually. As a storyteller, what is your advice to someone? How does one become a better storyteller?
How does one become a storyteller? Is that your question? A better storyteller. Yes, please. Well, since both Rohini and Deepa have suggested I take this question, being the teacher on the panel, I suppose. I think steeping yourself in stories, I think essentially trying to figure out how stories work. Stories work because they have a certain structure, they have characters, they have a setting, they have a plot. A plot has a beginning, middle, and end. Usually stories are character-driven. So you need to think about who your characters are. And sometimes when you think about characters, the story flows out of them. What are the characters' needs and wants? What are their motivations? What do they desire most in life? And what are the obstacles to that desire? And based on that, thinking about characters, observing around you, around the room, eavesdropping on dialogue, and then starting off a story around the characters would be the best advice that I would offer you, in addition to reading as much as possible.
Yeah, I'll simply like to ask, the stories when they were discovered in 11th century, were they written in Prakrit or in Sanskrit?
Stories that I translated?
Yeah, in 11th century when they were first taken up by these two writers,
Yes.
did they find it in Prakrit or in Sanskrit?
They were in Sanskrit. The Shivdas version that I based my work on, they were originally in Sanskrit.
Sanskrit, okay.
There is less clarity about Somdev's work. What he drew Somdev and Kshemendra, their original text, is not known. So we don't know which text it was that they worked from. There is a Nepali text also that exists, which some scholars feel could have been the original, but there's really not a very clear answer as to what they had to work with.
Because Prakrit was supposed to be common man's language, and it came later, so
No,
maybe...
Prakrit was very much there by then.
Yeah.
It was,
And one question to Madam Ranu. Which age group of children are you tackling for storytelling and all? It's very curious, to know, because you are so well versed with all the story, history and everything. So which age group are you?
So I work primarily with elementary school children. I work with grades, I've done it with pre-K to grade 5. And it works across the board. So I think ages 4 to 12 would be the group that I've worked mostly with. And they love stories.
Hi, I'm a German scholar and I have a question. Basically, just want to know that today in the postmodern, when the polarization is the theme where we interpret a thing from different point of views, so what difficulties do you find taking up these folk tales which already have a subject like cliche, like bad conquers the good? These are the cliches nowadays now, and people don't entrust for it. Now it's very like polarized, very point and like a sky, like the stars there are in the sky. They are very polarized. Everything is like so individual and very not so doesn't has a concrete one thought behind that. But there is polarized. Everything is so that thing. So what difficulties do you find? Like, for example, how can a writer can present a folk tale from there now in postmodern?
That's a really important question. Would folk tale is postmodern?
Well, when I am writing or presenting, as you say, an old story to the world today, I also have to say that since I am a product of the world today, my own biases also definitely come in. So as, for instance, as Deepa was saying, the misogynistic stories, for instance, if I have a choice, I leave them out, which is what I did when I translated the Panchatantra, because I said, no, the children today don't need to read about misogyny. But as Deepa was saying, when you are translating a text in full, you have to be faithful to the text. So you do translate it and don't think too much about the polarization today. You're presenting a medieval text or an old text and you say, look, this is what they wrote at that point of time. And you try to put it in the context of that time and you trust that your reader will realize that and be able to make the transition too. There's a bit of that involved.
Can I add to that a bit? You know that when you're retelling a folk tale, you have to decide what exactly are you going to present to your child reader. And you can't retell each and every folk tale because folk tales were for a general audience and we have to be more selective. And then again, there's a difference between the oral story and the printed story. Because when the printed story, goes out into the world, it has a different kind of validation. And then there are going to be parents and teachers who are going to challenge you. And the other thing is, even the Panchtant stories, well, you can't retell all the Panchtant stories for children. And I've seen on online groups, parents saying, they don't want their children to be reading the Panchtantra stories. And even my daughters, sometimes they tell me, you live abroad. Mom, I don't think my child gets too scared with some of these stories. So that's a choice you have to make. You don't want to make it too bland. You don't want to take away the story element, but you have to use your judgment. I hope it answers your question.
I'd just like to add on to that because I found the question so fascinating because you talked about polarization. And as a teacher, I really think storying is an act of curation. It is what you're putting in, it is as important as what you're leaving out. And in this day and age, it is really important for as many diverse voices to be heard as possible. So when you're talking about folk tales, and I know there are elements out there that, somebody might shrug off and say that is not suitable or this is not suitable. I'm of a different view. I think we need to present as much material as possible, lay it out in front of kids. Of course, you do it in a sensitive way as possible, but it is really important to have as much accessible material as possible for as diverse a group, so that people are ready to embrace difference. People are ready to say that, yes, such characters can exist, that there can be shades of grey. That's why I like the Vidyadhar so much, because they're kind of a grey character. They live in this liminal zone, which is in between. I like the Vetal so much because, what you do is, how he reacts is how you act. So I think it's really important to have as big a spread, as many voices in as many languages as possible. And I can't think of enough retellings that will be enough, frankly. Ma'am, I think we've run out of time.
We wish to thank Rohini Chowdhury and Deepa Agarwal in conversation with Ranu Bhattacharyya, and also to our festival director, Namita Gokhale, for her introduction. All three ladies will be available to sign copies of their books outside Durbar Hall at the book signing desk located on your left. We also wish to thank our sponsors, Denak Bhaskar. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.